which happens on Wednesdays in the Humanities and Social Sciences building. If you need any more information about that, we'll be happy to supply that. We also have coffee breaks held every Sunday outside the Starbucks in Hodges Library. We also have an open submission journal, the Platypus Review, which is right up at the front. You can they're free. You can get any copies you want. They're available around campus and at the front. Public forums such as these. And if you want any more information about our group, please sign in to get more information on future events or to get involved. Tonight's panel, Marx at 200. The point is to change the world as our major event for this semester. This year we've already had a good deal of activity around the world recognizing the bicentennial of Marx's birth, ranging from a week of the Chinese government's improbably reaffirming their commitment to Marxism, to smaller, more academic conferences organized by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Chicago and Berlin. These followed on the heels of last year's celebrations of the 150th anniversary of Marx's capital, and in many ways this year's commemoration were a little different from last year's. In this, one of the last such events of the year, we want to be sure to address Marx's own life, his own tasks. So, and of course, as you know, this past year marked the 200th birthday of Karl Marx, than whom even his ideological opponent, Isa Berlin, had to admit, quote, "No thinker in the 19th century has had so direct, deliberate, and powerful an influence upon mankind." This panel seeks to bring together intellectuals committed to exploring Marx's legacy in this post-Marxist age, those who, once more, seek somehow to bring that legacy to bear upon the world. Accordingly, we want to raise the question, what is the legacy of Marx's life as a revolutionary intellectual? That is, the legacy of the political writings and activities he contributed to the socialist workers' movement. So just a few guidelines before we get started so you'll know the structure of this talk. Each of the panelists have been asked to consider the description and formulating opening remarks. The guidelines for tonight are the panelists will have 11 to 12 minutes for opening remarks. I will discreetly signal when the panelists are at 10 minutes. I will indicate verbally when they have a minute to go, and become slightly more insistent when time's up. After opening remarks, there'll be opportunities for very brief responses by the panelists. We ask that the panelists please keep their responses to no more than 3 minutes each. Once they conclude their remarks and responses, I will then open the discussion up to the floor. Audience members should feel free to ask questions, but please keep them about 1 minute in length. Only if there are a lot of questions, I'll begin taking them in groups of 2s and 3s. Otherwise, we'll take them one at a time. We have allotted time for a sustained Q&A session. At about 10 minutes till 7, I will finish taking questions and allow the speakers about 10 minutes to make some closing remarks. We will conclude the event sharply at the top of the hour. And so now our speakers for tonight. In order of presentation, first, Dr. Arnold Farr. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky. His research interests are German idealism, Marxism, critical theory, philosophies of race, postmodernism, psychoanalysis, and liberation philosophy. He's published numerous articles and book chapters on all these subjects. He is co-author and co-editor of Marginal Groups in Mainstream American Culture. In 2009, he published Critical Theory and Democratic Vision, Herbert Marcuse, and the recent Liberation Philosophies. He's currently working on a book on race, a collection of essays on Marcuse, and a single-authored manuscript entitled Misrecognition, Mimetic Rivalry, and One-Dimensionality, Toward a Critical Theory of Human Conflict. Arnold is also the founder of the International Hubert Marcuse Society. Next is Dr. Spencer Leonard. He is a visiting professor at the University of Virginia who specializes in 18th and 19th century Southeast Asian history. He earned his PhD at the University of Chicago under the tutelage of eminent Marxist scholar Moïse Postone, 1942, recently died in 2018, who was his dissertation chair and advisor. Dr. Leonard taught at the University of Tennessee during the 2018 through 19 school year, and recently published an edited volume of Marx and Engels on Imperialism, Selected Journalism, 1851 through 62, with Raumann and Littlefield. Dr. Leonard is also a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society and former editor-in-chief of its monthly journal, the Platypus Review. He is currently preparing a book manuscript entitled Adam Smith in Calcutta, the East India Company, revolutionary imperialism, and the illiberal foundations of British India and Bengal, 1757 through 1785 for publication. And finally, we have Dr. Harry Dahms. He is a professor of sociology, co-director of the Center of the Study of Social Justice, and co-chair of the Committee on Social Theory at the University of Tennessee. Dahms' research and teaching pertains to the tensions in the modern age between economic change on the one hand and politics, culture, and society on the other. Interpreting the contributions of Marx and Weber in particular as foundations for a dynamic theory of modern society, he starts out from the proposition that is only from the perspective of globalization, including the debates about restructuring transnational corporations and neo-imperialism, that the contradictions and paradoxes of modern society can be disentangled. Dahms is also the editor of Current Perspectives in Social Theory and the director of the International Social Theory Consortium. So, without further ado, I leave our panelists to their opening remarks, starting with Dr. Farr. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for organizing this very important event, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. As I looked over the description of the event and the kind of issues that we'll be talking about tonight, two things stuck out at me that I want to say a few things about. One is Marx is a revolutionary intellectual, and the other is the notion of post-Marxism. So I'll begin with a few things about Marx as a revolutionary intellectual, and then say more about the post-Marxism. But before I do that, I do want to I guess, put on the table, when you think about post-Marxism, it's not always clear what that refers to. Does it refer to Marxist movements, various workers' movements, or various attempts to establish socialism in various countries? It may refer to that. We've seen a lot of these projects rise up and perhaps fail. Or does it refer to theory in terms of Marxian and Marxist theory? I'm going to focus on the latter this evening. So Marx is a revolutionary intellectual because his work was motivated by a desire for radical social change. However, I'm reminded of the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, when Marx says, intellectuals or philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world, but the task is to change it. With regards to interpretation with revolutionary intent, I argue that there is no post-Marxism, so I'll get to that in just a moment. We think about theoretical work and the kind of theoretical work that Marx was doing. Marx always remained an interpreter also, right? Although an interpreter with the desire to bring about change, an interpreter of the world with a thrust toward action, one never moves away from the moment of interpretation because the world is always changing, systems always changing. And Marx became aware of this, the way capitalism functioned, the way in which capitalism had to change and modify itself in order to maintain itself, right? So theory never comes to an end. There's always the need for theory. This sort of created a kind of tension in the 60s between members of the Frankfurt School like Herbert Marcuse and Theodore Adorno and various student leaders at the time who wanted to get in the streets and act and put theory aside for a while. But theory is an ongoing activity. Interpretation is an ongoing activity. With respect to post-Marxism, we've seen in the last couple of decades a number of books, articles written on post-Marxism, a number of conferences dedicated to the theme of post-Marxism, panels dedicated to the theme of post-Marxism. And at one level, it makes a lot of sense to talk about post-Marxism in terms of movements and theory, but I want to push back on that for a couple of reasons. One is when we read Marx, quite a few of the predictions that he made appear to be wrong in terms of the working class becoming self-conscious and rising up and throwing off its chains. We see that hasn't happened. In fact, at least in this country, it seems that the working class has dug in deeper in its support of the status quo or the establishment. But at the same time, it seems to me that the analysis of capitalism and the way that capitalism functions and the need for ever-growing expansion, the need for more and more production, the need for a greater accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few. None of that has changed. Marx seems to be dead on the money with regards to the way in which capitalism functions in order to maintain itself. There was a book published by a French economist, Thomas Piketty, in 2014, called Capitalism in the 21st Century. And that's an important work because Piketty wants to avoid being labeled Marxist, and he does talk about Marx a little bit, but basically, I take that book to be sort of a vindication of Marx in terms of the kind of conclusions that Piketty draws in terms of the ongoing growth of the gap between the rich and the poor. And Piketty argues that the gap is continuing to grow, and he sees no foreseeable reason why that's going to change, right? So there's still a need for the kind of analysis that Marx is doing in Capital itself. Another reason why I want to push back on the notion of post-Marxism is because Marxism, Marxian theory, is not a closed theory. The word post suggests to me that something has come to closure, and we're now working or developing theory after the closure of the previous theory. And Marxism is not a theory that has come to closure for a couple of reasons. One is the nature of the theory itself. It's a historical theory, which leaves itself open for historical modifications and developments. Secondly, Marx himself never finished his system. He was in the process of developing it when he became ill and passed away. Now, there are failures to Marxism that we might want to talk about. Now, hopefully at some point we can talk about some of these a bit later. But the various failures of Marxism, the failures of some of the predictions, the failures of various movements, does not suggest a post-Marxism. It does not suggest a abandoning of Marxism. What it does suggest is a reconstruction of Marxism. And we've seen that reconstruction in many different schools of thought, many different theories. Of course, I'm more familiar with reconstruction by members of the Frankfurt School, and particularly Herbert Marcuse, as they sort of brought Freud in to help them understand why the proletariat revolution that Marx predicted never took place in the way that Marx predicted it. And in addition to that, it seems that those who would benefit most from a revolution or some form of social change are most likely to resist it. And of course, we see that unfolding in front of our own eyes every day. But I want to bring in some other theoretical tools that we as Marxists may use in terms of reconstructing Marxism. Quite often when I give presentations, well, I'll just, an example, I gave a presentation at a Marcuse conference some years ago. I get this quite a lot from my Marxist friends, the argument or the claim that if we took care of the class issue, all other issues would take care of themselves. So I think on this particular occasion, I was given a paper on race, and this claim was made by a member of the audience, and I disagree with that. I think I appeal to the feminist notion of intersectionality at this point, that there are many other forms of oppression. They all have their own unique, distinct logic, history, and narrative, but they do all intersect in interesting ways, right? And the issue of race is important here because one of the tools that has been used to keep the working class from revolting is racism. Right? So if you can point to working class persons who are suffering, who feel that they're not getting their due, if you can point to someone else and say, you're suffering, you're not getting your promotions, you're not getting the raises, you're not getting the jobs because these unqualified people of whatever race, whatever gender, whatever sexual orientation are getting those things, then that's who becomes your, they become your target. That's who you turn to in terms of the conditions for your own suffering. And so in terms of reconstructing Marxian theory, I think the theory has always been alive in terms of whether theorists were engaging Marx or not. I mean, it is the case that Marx was prematurely put on the shelf by many theorists, and we spent a couple of decades doing our postmodern dance, right, while Marx was on the shelf. But at the same time, the truth of the theory was unfolding before our very eyes as neoliberalism came on the scene, and sort of constructed an agenda that would assure the success of capitalism for decades to come, right? And so as we're doing our postmodern dance, some of Marx's predictions about what would happen in terms of capitalism were coming true and unfolding in front of our very eyes. And we find ourselves in a place now where capitalism has become a kind of global monster that seemed almost invincible. But I suspect that there will be a way for us to sort of hopefully get through it. I'm going to stop there. I think that's about 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, you're at 9 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to stop there and just leave things open for question and answers later.
I got a question.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. We're going to have them do their opening, all their opening remarks first, and then we can get questions at that. Sorry about that.
First, I'm sorry to interject, Dr. Leonard, but as I was passing around the sign-in sheet in the back, I noted that it was pretty difficult to hear back there, especially over the air conditioner. So I just wanted to give everyone that might be affected by an opportunity. If you want, move up to the front. It's not a problem at all. And also, because we don't have microphones, if our speakers would be so kind as to project their voice, I really appreciate it.
I'll try.
Thank you.
I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to see so many of you out. I'd reiterate Matt's invitation to come to the front so you can hear. I should make a few corrections. I taught at the University of Virginia before I taught at the University of Tennessee. I no longer am a professional academic at all, but now work in publishing for a number of firms. My PhD is not in the history of Southeast Asia, but in the history of South Asia, the area of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And perhaps most predictably, the book is not actually finished. The edited collection that I'm currently at work on is nearing completion. Marx and Engels on Imperialism, Selected Journalism from 1851 to 1862. It's a pleasure to be back in Knoxville. And I am a Tennessean and a son of East Tennessee in particular. So though I lived in a number of places around the world when I was young, Knoxville was actually bourgeois society to me, even though I kind of grew up in a center of working class America, Kingsport, Tennessee, for those of you who know Kingsport. I went to Dahms Bennett, where we have the largest concentrated working class in Tennessee. My remarks have been delivered, a version of these remarks were delivered in New York City at the Left Forum last year, and in Patna, India, where there was a conference for the 200th birthday of Marx also last summer. I hope that they aren't too esoteric, but they certainly are written, so excuse me for reading. Marx is the philosopher of the 19th century revolution, specifically of the revolution of 1848. As philosopher of 1848, he is the founder of Marxism. And it is as the founder of Marxism that Marx attains a historical stature unlike that of any other modern intellectual. Now, after the collapse of the workers' struggle for socialism, he stands as the original and untranscendable critical theorist. It is as the intellectual of 1848 that Marx wrote all his works. It is as the intellectual of 1848 that he remains the most necessary and simultaneously the most thoroughly obsolete thinker of our time. Works written before the revolution were republished with prefaces specifying their relationship to Marx's subsequent post-revolutionary views, post-1848 views, And the figures comparable to Marx in terms of their necessity and their obsolescence are those associated with the revolution of 1848's greatest recurrences, the revolutionary intellectuals of 1905 and especially of 1917 to 1919. Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Lukács, Korsch, but of course above all Lenin, as well as the intellectuals of the revolution's definitive defeat of Stalinism, of the New Deal and fascism, and of the transformation of the Bonapartist into the authoritarian state, the Frankfurt School of Horkheimer and Adorno. But today, critical theory itself, the very consciousness of the task of 1848 and 1917 has been liquidated, and we are left either to testify to Marx's greatness or his irrelevance. The project of socialism collapsed with Marxism a century ago, and it has never been since renewed. In this sense, Marx is complicit with the world historical defeat of the project of freedom, just as he and the tradition of socialism associated with him were the last and greatest legatees of that project. Marx is buried in the ruins of Marxism. With Marxism's collapse, capitalism is itself liquidated. Politics regresses to naked oligarchy, authoritarianism, and to a self-deception respecting society comparable to pre-modern religion. Except this time, our self-deception is willful, even semi-conscious. Meanwhile, here in the university, the appointed educators of the young flee headlong from education into Democratic Party doxa and hyper-specialization, while the last generation to have so much as an inkling of the task that history imposes retreats into denial, retirement, and the grave. I'm referring here to the new left. After the inevitable failure of the long march through the institutions. Here at the University of Tennessee, after last year's jaw-dropping decision to turn university facilities over to white supremacists, the critical role of student groups in the educational mission of the university is being gutted in the name of free speech. To discuss Marx, therefore, is necessarily to uphold the seemingly impossible hope that the 19th century is not yet over, and that the 20th century hasn't swallowed it whole. It is also to raise the question, how will a new generation of potential intellectuals escape from the miseducation of scholars and the sectarian and activist left today? Last year, Marx turned 200. The only birthday present that he wants is to be forgotten. Like any good Enlightenment radical, he believes with Thomas Jefferson and other Jacobins that the earth belongs to the living. Like a good father, he wants to get out of the way now that his time is done. But the task of 1848 remains incomplete, and indeed, this is what the present suffers from. Before we can forget Marx, he must first and finally be made relevant. Though something of the full report may eventually be released to the public, this is the bit most likely to be redacted out of the Mueller report. That's a joke. The left is waiting for the Mueller report to tell them what the tasks of our time are. It's not going to be there, believe me, no matter if they don't redact the word. Marx and even Engels never fully imagined, because they never witnessed, Marxism as the historical force that it became in the first decades of the 20th century. But in their lifetimes, they did become aware of and specified the originary significance of their own thinking when they confronted the 19th century for themselves in 1848. In reflecting upon that experience above all, Marx and Engels recognized the necessity of their work. But 1848 had had its precursors. Marx was not unprepared for the revolution with which he is indelibly tied. In 1839, Auguste Blanqui attempted with the assistance of the League of the Just an armed uprising in Paris to overthrow the managed July monarchy of Louis Philippe. 1 month later, the English Chartists presented their monster petition to the House of Commons. Later that year, broke out in Wales the Great Newport Uprising. More directly experienced by Marx and Engels was the Silesian Weavers' Uprising of 1844, which is to say just at the crucial point of Marx's breathless pre-1848 political and intellectual development that led to the writing of the Manifesto. But there can be no doubt that the galloping, European-wide, and above all novel events of the Revolution of 1848 occasioned the one transformation as opposed to simple development or refinement in Marx's thinking, the one that set the agenda for the rest of his life. As Marx notes, the Revolution of 1848 did not undergo a regular, so to speak, textbook course of development. Indeed, in 1848, an unheard of fiasco was in store for the revolution. If, as Louis Menand remarked some years ago, Marx and Engels were philosophes of a second enlightenment, this is because the first enlightenment, including its Jacobin socialist offspring, had come to crisis in 1848. For the bourgeois revolution, it was enough to combine the thoughts of the moderns with the political imagination of the ancients. When the owl of Minerva flew at the close of the bourgeois revolution, it was recognized that crab walking, looking back to classical antiquity, a new freedom had dawned on the world. As Marx wrote by way of digesting the revolution of 1848, he's talking now about how it's not like the earlier revolutions. Earlier revolutions required recollections of past world history in order to drug themselves concerning their own content, in order to arrive at its own content. The revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury the dead. There the phrase went beyond the content. Here the content goes beyond the phrase. And here the question of putting paid to the whole prehistory of mankind arises, not simply as the re-achievement of the state of nature, i.e. a social state in which the free development of man's capacities is possible, but a specifically political problem, that of smashing the state as an opening to the overcoming of a disintegrating society. To overcome society's self-subjugation through democracy, the form of capitalist politics, party politics, had to be engaged, if only to raise the problem of capitalism to a higher plane. 1848 was the revolution of the 19th century. It would not be completed by the self-assertion of the Third Estate or even by the working out of the conflicts within the Third Estate, but only through critical engagement with party politics in a mass democratic context. The prehistory of mankind is to be overcome in socialism, the opening towards which, but only the opening for Marx, is what he calls the dictatorship of the proletariat. Only then would the rule of man over man, including the rule of the people over themselves, democracy, be overcome, and anarchy, or social self-regulation, take its place. The whole history of civilization is to be superseded because as the crisis of bourgeois freedom, capitalism draws into itself the whole history of society, including its earliest barbarism.
One more minute, please.
As Marx wrote, the February Revolution was a surprise attack, a taking of the old society unawares, and the people proclaimed this stroke as a deed of world historical importance, ushering in a new epoch. However, with the coup of Louis Bonaparte, the February Revolution is conjured away, and all that seems to be overthrown is not the monarchy, but the liberal concessions that were wrung from it in centuries of struggle. In other words, in the modern age, in the crisis of capitalist society, even the liberal gains that were made in the rise of society have been called into question. And instead we get a society of police, of military, of war, and of bureaucracy. It seems that the state has returned to its oldest form, to this shamelessly simple domination of the saber and the cowl. Adorno reflects on this when he writes, and I'll close with this: to recognize violence in the latest form of injustice, that is to say, the latent injustice contained in fair exchange, means simply to identify it with the prehistory that it destroyed. If all the oppression that man has ever inflicted on man culminates in the modern age, then the past is revealed in conditions and things as the trace of former suffering. The archaic silence of pyramids and ruins becomes conscious of itself in materialist thought. It is the echo of factory noise in the landscape of the immutable. Thank you.
All right, our last panelist. You want to, please wait just 1 moment while we set up the projector. I'll move from here. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll just
Okay, my notes clearly are too extensive, so you'll have to notify me when my time's running out. My paper, essentially, the presentation is in the same mold as Arnold's, looking at Marx primarily as a social theorist. When AJ introduced me, probably foreshadowed the fact that this is the case. The main point of this paper is that we are facing a challenge today that we have not faced before. Marx told us at least 150 years ago that we should expect this challenge, but we clearly, we can specify the we don't yet have to do it for present purposes, prefer to ignore this. This is weitersight or wiedersight. I haven't decided yet what the proper pronunciation is. What it refers to is, and this is what the subtitle suggests, that we are going through a process of the annihilation of life on Earth. So weitersight essentially as the generalization of genocide. Genocide is a particular version of weitersight. Weitersight has been going on since the beginning of industrialization. The vanishing point, so to speak, of industrialization is the elimination of life on Earth. These are two of my sources of inspiration. I like to use quotes occasionally. One quote is from Adorno: in psychoanalysis, nothing is true except exaggerations. Exaggerations. It's about to Schumpeter. It's an awkward translation. He was German too. Still was basically figuring out English as he was writing this. We all of us like a sparkling arrow better than a trivial truth. This is essentially the motto of this presentation. So I want to make a point here. Whether this point is absolutely sound and irrefutable is irrelevant, making an argument. Okay, so with regard to Adorno, the quote, what does psychoanalysis have to do with what you're doing here? It has quite a few things to do with it. Go ahead a bit. If you look at Marx as a revolutionary of thought, which he definitely was, as Professor Farr already indicated as well, then the issue essentially is what form did this take? I mean, we basically, the languages that theorists use at certain points in time, especially in history, are not the same languages that remain current, that attain the same power, the same relevance. In many cases, what happens is that over time, we develop a better language to verbalize what earlier theorists were trying to communicate. With regard to Marx, in this regard, it is quite productive to think of him as a social analyst. And so obviously we have psychoanalysis, we have a big literature on psychoanalysis. In addition to that, psychoanalysis has been discredited in professional psychology. So if you want to study psychoanalysis, you have to look closely where you actually can do that within legitimate departments of psychology, etc. Marx's agenda essentially was social analysis, in analogy to psychoanalysis before the term psychoanalysis was even coined, since Marx was a precursor of Freud. And so what's social analysis? It goes back to Marx as a critic of alienation. I won't go into details. If you look at psychoanalysis studies the effects that the psyche has on us in ways that we don't understand and which strongly influence our choices, decisions, and actions. So basically the reason why certain people, basically all of us really, need psychoanalysis is because we don't understand the workings of our mind, the workings of our psyche. As a consequence of that, it has an impact on how we make choices and how we live our lives, etc. That in order to be in charge of our lives, we would have to understand much better. Same thing applies to society. So we don't understand how society works, we don't understand the social forces that impact on us and the consequences and implications they have. Okay, so Marx as a revolutionary of thought, was a revolutionary in other regards too, obviously. I'm already halfway through.
Or more than half actually.
Okay. So one basically, if we talk about Marx today, 2019, then obviously it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about Marx without at the same time addressing the most important issues of our time. What are these most important issues of our time? They obviously have to do with, Piketty was mentioned, increasing social and especially economic inequality, which also translates into political inequality, which is consequential in democracies. Is major change happening with regard to trust in science and reason. We can get into a philosophical discussion of how to do that, obviously. It's definitely rapid change happening with regard to a commitment to education. If anyone is not familiar with this book, I strongly recommend it. Major changes are also happening with regard to expectations we have of the future. So the future is essentially, as it was called in Star Trek at some point, the undiscovered country. Most of us have no idea how to think about the undiscovered country, how to imagine the future that is not an extension of the present, with the addendum that it probably is much worse. That's sort of our imaginary today. In other regards, things are already getting much worse. Obviously, climate change is an issue. The destruction of animal and plant life is an important issue that I regularly cite in classes as well as in talks. Since 2010, vertebrate animals on planet Earth have been reduced by 58%. Since 2010, 58%. What has happened to us at the same time frame? We approximately have increased by 58%. So there's obviously a correlation. There's a shift of biomass happening. This is just one example. I mean, this basically, if you allow yourself to contemplate these kinds of issues, it's really frustrating. It makes you angry, obviously. Another report just came out that makes this point: rapid decline of the natural world is a crisis even bigger than climate change. Few people are paying attention to it. It's our right to eat animals and to destroy plants at will, etc. Why think about this? In addition to that, as I mentioned already, population increases. Financial debt has been exploding over the course of the last few decades. If anyone wants to see a detailed report, look at the work of Tony Smith. It's really horrifying how bad that is. There have been huge increases in production, obviously, which to a significant extent go on the account of nature, but there have been very little increases in productivity. So since Marx is a productivist, theorist, critic of capitalism, development of capital, in terms of production, not just distribution, productivity increases really have gone down over the course of the last 30, 40 years. At the same time, of course, we are confronting, it's just a matter of time, by all accounts, artificial intelligence and the possibility of rapid automation. If anyone wants to talk about that, talk to this guy. And so this is all aggravated further by the growing influence and return of ideology, a lack of willingness to face ourselves and our space selves, as both actors and as products of society, the role of the economy in social, political, and cultural life, as well as in dominant forms of organization and technology. So to just make the first main point here, and obviously I'm not getting anywhere out of this, Marx was trying to figure out the underlying logic of change in modern societies. This is obviously how it continues to be very relevant today. It's not the only way, but it's definitely one important way. So he was trying to figure out the underlying logic of change in modern, as he called them, bourgeois societies. This logic takes the form of economics and technology, but in a specific register, namely the capitalist register, capitalist mode of production, etc., capitalist industrialization. But it really ultimately, and this is where Stone is really important, who also was referenced already, enters the picture very strongly. It also is, it manifests itself as a social logic. So essentially we exist in an inverted world. We look at the consequences resulting from how we economize, how we allocate resources, etc., etc., etc. We assume that that has a certain impact on how we exist politically, socially, culturally. But the language we employ to do so is already wrong because the social has been infused over the course of the process of industrialization and the history of modern society with the economic to such an extent that it only analytically can be separated. So to look at the economic and to look at the social, we can obviously intellectually distinguish the two in terms of underlying logics. Materially, empirically, this distinction really doesn't exist anymore. And Marx saw this coming in the 1800s. So what this means then is that to understand modern bourgeois societies, our societies requires a willingness to confront a paradox which to illuminate was precisely Marx's point. Okay, what does this translate into now? Essentially, and this is what both previous presentations were getting at already, if you're trying to understand in contemporary language what Marx was trying to figure out and what subsequent neo-Marxist theories like critical theory, like Frankfurt School, etc., were trying to figure out, was the driving force behind change in modern society. This driving force is not the capitalist mode of production as such. It's not capitalism. It's definitely not us. It's what I and others have been referring to as the logic of capital. There is something paradoxical going on. Marx liked to use the language of contradictions to verbalize this. So the driver in our societies is essentially, this is the main point here, a non-human process with which we are completely wrapped up, of course. So the logic of capital is supposed to serve us. So wealth is supposed to be produced so that we can create better conditions of existence, a better relationship between society and nature, etc., 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 etc. What is happening instead, however, is that this logic of capital is continually asserting itself stronger and stronger. This translates into the specific forms of organizations we employ. So bureaucracy is not just bureaucracy, it's bureaucracy as it is typical of modern society, which faces the challenge of economic scarcity in the interest of producing wealth. It's not a paradox. I could expand this further, I obviously don't have time. How does this translate then to into right side? Basically, I've already hinted at this before. The problem is that this is an interesting book in this regard. We've delegated responsibility to make decisions about our own lives and each other's lives to a process that essentially makes choices for us on an ongoing basis in a manner that we don't notice. We've internalized this. We've internalized it socially, in terms of social organizations. We've internalized it. And so Arnold, Farr's statement, for example, about the working class basically being promulgator of this process very much confirms what I'm driving at here. Essentially, we are participating currently in a process that is bound, unless something major happens, to reduce the amount of opportunities, of circumstances in which life can exist further and further and further. This applies to us ourselves too, obviously. This is what Marx was all about. The more workers there are, the less valuable they are, because less bored they are, because they can be replaced easily, etc., etc., etc. This book, subtitle, I don't know whether you can read this, is Zombies, Vampires, and Global Capitalism, essentially has extracted all the references in Marx's writings to zombies, to vampires, to monstrous characters, to ghosts, to specters, etc., and how they essentially visualize for us how exactly this logic is working.
If you'd like to take, I think it's okay. I think we're all right on time. If you'd like to take a couple additional minutes to finish up.
That's fine. I can look at it.
All right, so now that we have finished our opening remarks, I'm ready to now open up the floor to, or actually, no, I'm sorry, not getting things out of order. I apologize. Actually, what we really will do is a brief 3-minute responses from each of the panelists to each other's remarks if they want to add anything. We can start with Dr. Farr if you like.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have much to say in terms of adding anything. I do want to reflect for a moment. I was happy to see Professor Dahms sort of mention Freud a little bit, talk about psychoanalysis. And I wanted to, one question on a point of clarification, was your position that psychoanalysis is obsolete or just that ideas in the air?
It's definitely not at all obsolete, and there has been a major resurgence of interest in psychoanalysis, especially in social theory.
Yeah.
There have been lots of new publications, etc. So rather than it being superfluous, we need to refine it much further and complement it with what I've been referring to as social analysis, which obviously is much more intricate and complicated, etc. Time does not permit.
That stuck out to me because quite often when I'm giving lectures in various places and Freud gets mentioned, I almost always get somebody from the audience who reminds me that Freudian psychoanalysis is obsolete. And I remind them how alive and well it is in terms of not just more recent revisions of the theory by other theorists, but a particular use that was made of psychoanalysis that actually aided in the ongoing development of capitalism. And I have in mind now Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. Any of you heard of Edward Bernays? All right, so it was Edward Bernays. He's actually the father of public relations in the United States and was hired for several projects by the United States government in the 1920s and wrote 2 famous books in the 20s. One is called Propaganda. I can't remember the title of the other one, but they were basically books about how to manipulate people's desire, right? And he learned this from the theories of his uncle, who actually didn't want him to put his work to that kind of use. But he was hired to do all kinds of campaigns for not just the government, but for various businesses in the United States. So just quickly, around this time, women didn't normally smoke, around the 1920s and 30s. They didn't normally smoke, right? And so Edward Bernays was hired by the tobacco company to help them boost their sales. So he hired 100 women to dress up as the Statue of Liberty and walk down the streets of New York smoking. And it became fashionable at this point for women to smoke. And of course, once women started smoking, you got a whole new segment of the population smoking now. So that's going to boost tobacco sales, right? And so you got a kind of sinister use of some of the best insights of Freudian psychoanalysis being used to further advance capitalist logic, as Professor Dahms was talking about. I just wanted to raise that point because I was happy to see him bring Freud into the picture a bit.
Dr. Leonard?
Yeah. I guess I want to put a little pressure on this question of social theory. Of course, I was taught by Mosh Baston, and he would talk in terms of social theory. And I really questioned this because it seemed to me to threaten to naturalize the crisis of the left, and particularly of left intellectuals. For Marx and for Marxism, and by Marxism I'm talking specifically about a current within mass socialist political parties in the late 19th and early 20th century, in the United States and in Western Europe, right? Where the issue wasn't guerrilla movements in the third world, the issue wasn't national liberation movements, the issue wasn't, essentially peasant revolutions, but the issue was socialism in the heart of capitalism. Intellectuals associated with that project were not academics. They weren't writing, academic publications. And I'm not denigrating anybody's work. We all deal with the circumstances that we find ourselves in. But one of the things that seems valuable to me about the first generation of the Frankfurt School is they thematize the problem and in a sense the impossibility of critical theory in the absence of a mass movement for socialism. And that's a running theme in Horkheimer and Adorno's work. You can see it when they, in a recent publication from Verso, now about 10 years old, called Towards a New Manifesto, where they consider rewriting the Communist Manifesto at the time of the crisis of official communism in 1956, when Khrushchev attacked the cult of personality and the leadership of Stalin at that time. You can see it in one of Adorno's last writings, which I was sort of echoing without quoting. His address in 1968 on Marx, which was Late Capitalism or Post-Industrial Society, which is also found in English under the title Is Marx Obsolete?, where Adorno says, of course Marx is obsolete, and he's more relevant than ever, which was, in a sense, the theme that I was trying to deal with in my remarks. And to quote that, or to repeat that 50 years later, because obviously in the 150th anniversary of Marx's birth was celebrated in a much more fitting way than we can do today in 1968, and a still more fitting way was celebrated his 100th birthday, which was a time of revolution in Europe in 1918. And so I feel that we have to talk about the crisis of Marxian intellectualism across the 20th century in the face of the decline of the workers' movement for socialism, particularly as politically constituted, not just as essentially a movement politics that can only ever be in an American context an appeal to the Democratic Party. I'm sorry if it's too much time.
No, it's, I'm trying to figure out what the core of your question is with regard to social theory. And if you look at social theory or critical theory, then one of the first things we notice is that there is not a lot of optimism there, obviously, because there's not much of a basis for optimism on the basis of many of the diagnoses. If you look at Durkheim, if you look at Weber, for example, if you look at, Parsons, of course, was an exception, but if you look at the Frankfurt School, optimism was not part of the agenda because everything pointed in the direction of things not turning out too well. Obviously, then after World War II, and I'm sure you know much more about the intricacies of this than I do, since you're a historian, and I'm not, discourse about society, the discourse about the left, the discourse about the prospects of socialism, of transformation, etc., completely changed in the context of the Cold War, where certain things could be discussed and other things could not be discussed. And if certain things were discussed in a particular way, then those discussions immediately were interpreted to have particular implications. So any attempt, for example, to suggest that not everything is great in modern bourgeois Western democratic societies was taken to be an endorsement of Stalinism, for example, or of Soviet communism, etc., which meant that the entire debate that was happening around that time during the late 40s, 50s, into the 60s definitely, was warped as a consequence of that. One of my main professors, my main German professor, was Ralph Arnold. I don't know whether you've heard of him. He's the one who co-invented with an American sociologist what's called conflict theory, which in itself is a kind of travesty in terms of how it was set up. But he was actually the only sociologist in Germany after World War II to write about Marx. His first dissertation was on was entitled Marx in Perspective, which was unheard of, and his habilitation, which is like he then wrote a second dissertation in London to explain, basically to take up some time, and then he wrote his habilitation, which is like a major dissertation. The title of that is that became a classic, is of course Class and Class Conflict in Industrial Society. And so two things happened at the same time. On the one hand, he had the audacity, an immediate audience as a consequence of trying to bring Marx into sociology, where he had not been up until that point. But he did so instantaneously by domesticating Marx into conflict theory, as opposed to systems theory, or symbolic interactionism. So that he, on the one hand, stressed the importance of Marx, but then immediately took the wind out of Marx. With regard to, there were a few more things a couple more points I wanted to make with regard to social theory that have a bearing on this. One is, of course, that critical theory, and this applies to Marx historically, definitely, too, is a kind of message in the bottle. I think Adorno was the one who coined that term, that basically there is no audience for what we are doing. The number of people who are interested in illuminating the workings of modern society is very small. And so what's the point of it all if there is no social movement to back it up, if there is not a clearly identifiable segment of the population that's interested in this kind of illumination of society? And so the early Frankfurt School responded to this by saying, well, basically what we are doing intellectually is not a function of the market, so to speak. This is pre-neoliberalism, so to speak. We're interested in the issues on their own terms, and potentially at some point the change will happen that will require the kind of knowledge, the kind of information that we are able to provide, the kind of framings, and it might come to bear and enable society or humankind to confront a number of challenges more effectively. The other side of the story, and you basically both of you touched on this, is that we basically, and this is the real downer. This would have been the real downer of my short presentation if I would have gotten there. Is that we really need to adjust our perspective on ourselves. We like to think of ourselves, humanity is the greatest thing that ever happened in history, etc., 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 etc. As Franz de Waal, who was here a couple of weeks ago, this planet's foremost primate scientist, who's at Emory, put it on NPR last week. You might have heard it. I recommended it to one of my students. We suck. We're terrible. We basically don't give a shit if we destroy things, etc., etc., etc. As long as it reinforces the existing social structure in a manner that is beneficial to a certain segment of the population, which has been shrinking, but the share of wealth that they've been attracting has been increasing at the same time, things are fine. But they are not fine. We are destroying this planet. And we are not just destroying the environment, we are not just destroying the oceans. We also inflict a lot of damage on ourselves by the way we live. Obviously, stress is going through the roof, as it has been doing for years. And so we basically are actually destroying life. But we at the same time buy into this idea that humans are just great, and that we are well-meaning, and that we basically want things to turn out better. Well, let's put that to the test. Let's see whether that empirically actually is the case. And so this brings us to another question that's been at the center of critical theoretical debates since Marx. From what vantage point do we criticize modern bourgeois democratic society? I mean, basically, what informs our perspective? So we've been trying to do this in a number of different ways. The early Frankfurt School, basically Adorno, Marcuse, Horkheimer, they really didn't care about this question. It was basically the activity in itself of engaging in a committed fashion to critical self-reflexivity that justified itself. Then in Habermas and Honneth, the next two versions of critical theory in the tradition, it took a normative form, so that we basically need to explain our critical stance in terms of the kinds of norms and values that inform our perspectives, and justify the audacity we have for criticizing the war that we're all part of, etc. And so what I'm suggesting here, and this also has been part of the presentation, is that we basically should step back from us. And this is another version of decentering. That we should look not at the need for applying critical reflexivity with regard to society from our perspective, but from the planetary perspective. So the actual consequences that result from the way we economize, because they are empirically identifiable, testable, confirmable effects that result from this that are not sustainable in a much more comprehensive sense than just in terms of sustainability with regard to resources, etc., etc., etc. And if the trends continue, then in a few years there will be another 3 or 4 billion humans, and that fuel animals, for example, and plants, etc. So what? How will we deal with that? Will we start eating ourselves, each other, etc.? I mean, that's sort of the pointed statement, because there are few indications that things will not go in that direction. Of course, there could be some disastrous epidemic that reduces our numbers, or an artificial intelligence that's not so benevolent and that will basically take care of the problems objectively by getting rid of some of us, etc. But that's sort of the implication. So if we want to conceive of how we can use Marx today, we basically have to emphasize, as several social theorists have done in recent years, the dark side of our societies to a much greater extent. And so one of the consequences of this Cold War, post-war mindset that took hold was not to do so. And so we've not been paying attention to the potential for right-wing, basically the remaining and increasing appeal of right-wing solutions to imminent social, political, economic, cultural problems, etc. So that's an expression of that. So
Okay,
now,
it's okay. I wanted to get you to a good side point. All right, so now we have about 40 whole minutes for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for any member of the panel, the floor is now yours.
Or the panel as a whole.
Or the panel as a whole, not for the It could be any one individual or the panel as a whole. Please go ahead.
I have a question for the panel as a whole. I mean, it sounds like what you gentlemen were saying is, taking social responsibility for our actions and for the environment and the planet itself, which is something I think everybody can agree with. But growing up as a young man or a young woman in the state of East Tennessee, you're of course going to hear a lot of objections to Marxism. Among these objections, to condense them into a short, concise statement, fit into a minute or a minute and a half, you may hear somebody from maybe the right say, well, what about Russia? After Red October, after the revolution, all that kind of stuff. You had kids who were rounded up, landowners who were shot, were sent to the Gulag. Furthermore, you go to China, you go to the Cultural Revolution, to Mao's Great Leap Forward, and you find people starving to death because the means of production didn't really work out there with his plan. And also you had college students who were my age who were just completely pissed off, who were murdering landlords because they were the bourgeoisie oppressors, and that was a mindset. So to condense that down into one solid thing would be to say the modern claim, I feel like, against Marxism would be, well, Marxism has never worked anywhere. That's the claim. And what makes you think that it would work now? So to restate that or re-say that would be to say something to the effect of, last time everybody drank that Kool-Aid, everybody died, but now you want us to drink it again. The last one killed us, but the new one's going to kill us. That's a lot of the objections that I get, and that's a lot of objections that I think that I hear. How would you guys kind of tackle that and go against that?
Well, I guess the first thing I would do, it's unfortunate that when people hear the term Marxism, it's been used in the media and attached to societies like Russia and all of that. When you talk about Marx, you have to separate Marx from these societies where there's been some so-called attempt at establishing a Marxist society. right? And work within the text of Marx. Marx would have rolled over in his grave at some of the revolutions or events that were carried out in his name. There's a whole list of reasons why things didn't work in Russia. And Russia is actually, to call Russia a communist country is sort of a misnomer. It's actually a form of state capitalism and not communism as Marx talked about communism. And also one of the things I remind my students of, because I do get that quite a bit when I'm teaching Marx in the classroom, is that I tend to focus on Marxism as a critique as opposed to a blueprint for society, right? And we've not yet fully thought through, or I guess, we've not had a sort of a global discourse about Marxism as critique, the critique of capitalism, right? And when you start talking about Marxism as critique, you kind of disarm people a bit, right? Because there's something about the critique that's fundamentally right, that's almost undeniable. So that's sort of my approach, to focus on as critique, not blueprint. And if we can carry through with the critique and get that right, and then from there, have some conversations about the kinds of actions necessary to bring to fruition the desire for a classless society, then I think we're doing something substantial and legit. Right? So I could say more, but I'll stop and give others a chance. But that's where I start.
To say a couple of things. First of all, as an East Tennessean, I would tell you, don't believe that the culture here is conservative. There is a great revolutionary tradition of East Tennessee going all the way back into the 19th century. And some of that's even being expressed in what might come out as right-wing attitudes. Arguments about individual dignity and the dignity of labor, etc., are not inherently right-wing arguments. About the actually existing communist states. This is really what I was trying to drive home in my presentation, which is the catastrophe of the 20th century. To understand that the discontent in society will still reach in its most coherent form to the legacy of socialism. It can go nowhere else. It is the greatest failure of our past, and we live in the wake of that catastrophe. You're not going to find the deep discontent in society going anywhere else except to socialism and counter-revolutionary forms of anti-socialism, basically. In other words, socialism and its antitype, fascism, defines the political spectrum of the world today, as much as our politics tries to avoid it. And anytime you see a political crisis, you'll find that out, like in recent times, where the left is screaming fascism at Trump, and the right is screaming socialism at capitalist politicians like Bernie Sanders. It tells you what time it is, which is you live in the wake of the 20th century. You don't live in any other new time, right? And it's important to realize that we live in the wake of ruin politically. And this is, I think, some of what Dr. Dahms is getting at. And it's important to realize that it's mediated by democracy. This is one of the hardest points to understand, right? That democracy is the political form of capitalism. And it's not that socialism is anti-democratic, but to understand democracy as a form of society's self-domination. And this is what I think the issue of the logic of capital translated into a political register is really about, right? And this is why I focused on Marx as a political thinker, because the prototype of fascism in the 19th century was the Second Empire in France. And what Marx points out is that the Emperor Louis Napoleon is brought to power by universal suffrage elections, the first universal suffrage elections in France. So the question of demagogy in democracy, right? We all hate democracy. It's important to remember that, right? They're deplorable. And why do those rubes have the right to vote, right? And let's depress the turnout. That's what our politics is always about. It's about depressing the turnout, right? He's unfit for government, right? They are elite eggheads that don't understand your problems. It's never an attempt to, in other words, there is an anti-democracy in the heart of democracy in capitalism. And you see that all the time. Now, I could give you a Stalinist answer to your question. I mean, I would point out to you as a historian of India that the history of Russia and China in the 20th century are huge success stories as far as development is concerned. They're monumental success stories in terms of literacy and longevity and every other measure of human well-being. It's just, that's not what Marxism is about. There's no such thing as a Marxist society. Marxism is about the end of capitalism. It's a current within socialism. That's all that it ever was. It's actually the critical self-consciousness of socialism. Marx's object of critique as a dialectical thinker is socialism. That's his ultimate object of thought. He's saying the attempt to put people to work, the attempt for everybody to get a job, it's the economy stupid, put people back to work, which is what democracy is going to be about, and it's what socialist politics is about, is going to result in massive unemployment. That the way that capital will put people to work is through automation. It builds unemployment into its employment projects. And we now deal with billions of people in the world who are effectively unemployed or massively underemployed, right? We have a massive reserve army of labor, as Marx would put it. The point of the capitalist state, and this is something to really think about, the deep force and violence that is required to reproduce our society every day. Our cities are under occupation. There are 40,000 policemen in New York City, which is about, 40 to 80 times more than was considered a cause for revolution in 1776, and is enshrined in our Constitution as being unconstitutional, right? Having standing armies. You have to think about how profoundly illiberal our society is. It can't be liberal because at the heart, and this is why I said, at the heart of just buying and selling, at the heart of just the labor market, to get people back to work is violence, anti-competition, the rejection of the free market, monopoly, and bureaucracy. And that's what's hard to get across about Marxist theories, that Marx is arguing for a world in which our reproduction, in a way that is pacified in relationship to nature as a whole, in other words, that allows for its indefinite reproduction, as well as pacified in relation one man to another society with itself. That would be a society that did not require coercion. And we live in the unbearable recognition of that possibility. To recognize that that's been possible for at least 100 years is something that we wake up with, recognize, and immediately suppress. because the recognition of the possibility of human freedom is incompatible with what we have to do to ourselves to live here. And that breeds an authoritarian psychology that's that's massive and is the underlying, in a sense, individual basis of capitalist democracy.
It's not really necessary to add anything to that. I'm a professional theorist, so I think in terms of these eggheads, of course. So I usually refrain from using the language of Marxism, because that's another can of worms, so to speak, which is getting into the differences between Marx and Engels, etc., 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 etc. But when a term to keep in mind to address what you were thinking of is self-possession. Term doesn't really exist in English. What would be a
Self-possession?
Self-possession, right? I'm thinking of Mündigkeit. Adorno participated in a discussion with an educator in the 60s on radio. I don't remember whether it was state radio or national radio. The title of it was Education for Mündigkeit. Mündigkeit doesn't exist in English. So one has to come up with some kind of word that sort of fits that. Self-possession is the word, or maturity. Those are terms that have been used in English to capture what Adorno was getting at. A democracy only works if individuals are taught how to be self-possessing, how to be truly mature. Modern consumer societies cannot afford them, quite literally cannot afford them. So there is a regime of control, a regime of surveillance that continuously needs to be maintained in order to make sure that the number of people who attain something like self-possession, something like actual maturity, stays below a certain level. George F. Kennan, who was one of the United States' main diplomats during the Kennedy years, he referred to Americans as basically teenagers, perpetual teenagers. And so the reason why he did so was because Americans have to buy stuff. They have to define their self-worth in terms of the kind of work they do and in terms of the kinds of goods they own. And so someone who's self-possessing will at least ask him or herself once or twice, do I really need this? Will this really make me happy or happier? Because, and I'm sure everyone in this room has noticed this, as long as you don't have item A, you're looking forward to how great you will feel once you own item A. Then you get to that point. You purchase item A. And what a downer. It doesn't do any of the things that you hoped it would do. You now have this item, you have a new car, right? It feels good occasionally, but now you want other things, etc. I mean, Durkheim was really good about this. Humans essentially are insatiable. They get one thing, they want the next thing, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't translate into happiness, etc.
I can just add to that very short. The idea of being self-possessing is bourgeois. It's literally to be to no longer be a slave, right? To own yourself, to take the words literally, right? The prospect of being a mature individual, of being an individual at all, arises with what I was calling bourgeois society, arises with what is, in a sense, popularly called capitalism, not what Marx calls capital. What Marx calls capital is when the idea of being a self-owning person, being a wage laborer, not having to be beholden to any man, of course, an immense revolutionary project that's ongoing, right? It's the end of slavery, it's the end of Jim Crow, it's the end of patriarchy, right? Is to have a job, right? It's a vast revolutionary project that's self-contradictory. It's freedom that in self-contradiction, it's to get a job putting you out of a job. In other words, for workers to try to go to work, they generate systemic unemployment. They undermine the basis, the bourgeois basis of self-possession, of the possibility of being mature, of the possibility of being a free individual, and they are brought literally to their knees by a system that instead feels like a popularity contest. where you'd better conform, and you'd better not have any unusual ideas, and you better not have any funny clothes, or any reason that could cause you to not win in the lottery that is our society. Because all around you, people are slipping through the cracks, right? And this is psychologically corrosive, right? It undermines the basis of self-possession, even as it promises it. That's in a sense, the working of the contradiction of capital at a psychological level.
We can't really use conventional established language to understand this process. It's obvious. So basically, once you start using a different language, you notice that this is happening in lots of different ways, not consistently. And it's not that easy. One has to pay very close attention to what is happening at a particular point in time, in a particular place, and what that actually means for the future of society. Basically, last semester students asked me, I don't remember who was there, basically how do we evaluate essentially the value of any kind of scientific contribution, for example, including social scientific contributions, etc. The only way to do it is really to ask whether it will make the future better or worse. And we're definitely right there. We make constantly choices that translate into better futures and worse futures. Every single day, and each of us is completely wound up with this, so to speak. But one example for the workings of the logic of capital I heard about just a couple of days ago is that what happens when the federal level or the state level withdraws funding for the municipal level, for cities and for small towns. So tax income shrinks, as taxes are evil, we know that. Taxes are evil. Taxes may be evil too, but taxes are evil. And so basically, how do these small towns and the cities sustain themselves? They have to increase their income through fines, through arresting people, etc., etc., etc. If you look empirically at where police forces are sent to do so, they are not sent in the wealthy neighborhoods, in the wealthy parts of town where people have a lot of money. They are sent in the poorest parts of town, and people there disproportionately are fined for stuff that no one ever would conceive of finding someone in the wealthy neighborhood. And what happens to the people then who don't have any income, any wealth anyway, who are now ending up in prison? They have to pay those fines, but they can't pay those fines. Well, what do they do? Well, since they can't pay those fines, they are violating the fine decree. So since they're not paying anything, they get to the next level of incarceration, etc., etc. And this causes a snowball that a certain segment of the population is far more likely to end up in than other parts of the population, etc. And so this is where this logic is playing out. It's very cunning. Hegel liked to use the term of the cunning of reason. That there's a cunning of reason, and when he was describing it before the rise of capital actually taking hold in Germany was a backward country at that point. Still, there's other regards, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But when Hegel was writing, capital was not manifest yet. Definitely not in Germany, and in England in particular, yes, but it needed Marx to basically recognize what was actually playing out there. And so Hegel basically in his dialectic said, there's a cunning, the task of philosophy is to interpret prior history in a manner that enables us to recognize that there's a positive development happening into the future, and humans are just essentially cogs in the wheel of the cunning of reason. Marx became necessary because this abstract, universal, independent form of reason took on a concrete form. And this form is tied to the logic of capital. So basically, if we use the kind of language that AG has been using, etc., the issues that in science fiction as well as in labor studies these days are being addressed frequently, capital is essentially the first artificial intelligence. So we basically, if you want to find out how artificial intelligence is likely to work once it takes hold in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, the likelihood that it will be modeled on this cunning of a particular version of reason is extremely high. So basically people like Ray Kurzweil and various other punks who think that AI will be our redemption, that basically once the AI emerges, it will solve all of our problems. That's extremely unlikely. Not unless we specifically design it for that purpose, but how do we specifically design it for that purpose to the extent to which our identities are completely wound up with this entire mechanism? So, I mean, basically the selves, ourselves, are very much part of this. Because we didn't create ourselves, none of us created him or herself. We were born into a particular society that operates according to certain principles. We, if we want to function in society, everybody in this room functions, because otherwise we wouldn't be here, replicates the panels that are necessary in order to attain success within this larger system that we are part of, etc. And so essentially, in terms of what I said before about us not being that great, we basically also have to recognize that each of us individually doesn't really understand how we came about. We're basically computers who don't understand the forces that created the programs according to which we, as computers, our brains work. So this brings us back to psychology then, psychoanalysis, etc. What we need to have is an integration of psychoanalysis and social analysis.
There's been one up here too.
Yeah, actually, we'll get to Matt later. Can we, one up there, please? Here.
First of all, I'm a little confused. What you are describing, it seems to me what you're describing as capital and the evils that capital imposes on self-possession, self-actualization. It seems to me that what you're describing is not capitalism, you're describing civilization. I mean, as soon as you had the first cities, people had to maintain the roads in those cities, so they had to have taxes. People had to have responsibilities, so they had to have armies, to protect them. So it doesn't seem to me like this is specific to capitalism. It seems to me like it's all civilization. The opposite of capitalism doesn't seem to be Marxism. It seems to be anarchy. Like no.
Do you want to?
Yeah.
This is something that you're familiar with too.
Yeah. Well, capitalism arises from a contingent set of circumstances that ultimately are world historical in significance, which is, let's call it a slave revolt in Western Europe. The history of civilization is a history of caste society, essentially of slavery, where your position in society is a function of your birth, and we see that all the time. I mean, we see that in all most of our surnames in English, like Smith and Chandler and Porter and Farmer. These are caste names. They designated what your role in society was, and it was your father's role and your father's before him. So capitalism is a result of a revolution that generates a market in labor, that turns labor into a commodity, that allows for people to do different jobs. Ultimately, it results, you can imagine, so to speak, the slaves of Europe, the peasants of Europe, fleeing to the cities and doing or coming to do what kids today call McJob. In other words, they're not chandlers or porters or farmers. They're doing whatever job pays. And that's what we mean by a good job today. We mean a good job is one that pays. It doesn't matter what it is. Right? This is completely new and was not there in the prior history of civilization. Right? So what Marx analyzes as capitalism is a system of free labor, which is a basis, as the theorists of capitalism say it is, the base, like Adam Smith and the founders, our founding fathers in the United States, is a system based on liberty, which they took to be new, or a rebirth of what had existed prior to civilization. Prior to civilization, we could say that there wasn't the social domination of men over men in hunter and gatherer societies, the first 190,000 years or so of a human existence. Now that's a debatable question, you know, to what degree that's romanticized, what degree of violence was involved in hunter and gatherer societies. But the difference is that in hunter and gatherer societies, they're not conscious of their freedom. They're not conscious of the fact that they're creating their society and their needs and the means of satisfying them. We are consciously free. We are aware of the fact that we create this society and that we can survive in ways and through practices that human beings never imagined before, like drinking Diet Coke or eating hamburgers or all sorts of things that previous society didn't imagine was a way to reproduce life, right? Much less, you know, working on computers, etc. 1,000 innumerable needs and innumerable ways of satisfying them, which are in constant change. Now, what Dr. Dahms put up in terms of the question of alienation is how our collective capacity to determine what it is to be human in time has become alienated from us, has become, so to speak, a structure over and against which we struggle. In other words, and this is where we differ, I think, is that I would not call this a non-human logic. Capitalism is the product of human actions. It is the product of what we're doing, including politically, and in fact, above all politically, because it is only through politics, it is in politics that we raise the question of our freedom to a conscious practice in society. We say we want to create a better world for our children. That is a consciousness of history and of the fact that we make it. And every politician will say it, left, right, and center. Right? The problem is that that conscious and collective self-determination is a structure of domination at the same time. That's the condition of capital for Marx, viewed politically, what he calls imperialism, i.e. a state that we create democratically that oppresses and subjugates society itself, right? That is our own freedom to which we're subject. This is not a problem. That past civilization was subject to its freedom only in an unconscious way. That's why I said that our ideology today is almost like religion. It's almost like religion in pre-modernity, by which, you know, medieval Christianity, in the sense that it's all pervasive. But the difference is that you have to lie to yourself. You are conscious that what you're doing to yourself is, and what we are doing to ourselves, is unbearable and unsustainable. And that generates all kinds of ramifying consequences.
Outside of theory, how would a socialist society look that would not require people to still be a means of production, to still create products, to still have people in charge of it? That's why I'm saying, I'm not talking about theory. I mean, I can't see a socialist construct not creating a surrender of yourself to a form of slavery as well. And that's been in history too.
Just very briefly, because I want my other panelists to respond to this. I would say that it's just a bourgeois, it's the utopia of our founding fathers. Our founding fathers, the Enlightenment, imagined that you could be interdependent without being enslaved. That you could be free in a structure of interdependence. That was the promise of modernity. That we could collectively, as in relations to one another, also be free individuals. So the promise of socialism is the world that the Enlightenment imagined. It's a world without war. It's a world without coercion. It's a world of human cooperation. The only difference being that the basis of that must change, because we can no longer be that as workers. As workers, some of us are going to work 70 hours a week so that tens of others have no job. Or entire countries will be overworked and overstressed so that other countries can be reduced to poverty, beggary, and the goodwill of NGOs. Right? That's the system that we have today. I'm sorry, I don't mean to preclude others from addressing the question.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit to that, not much, in terms of this kind of divide that capitalism creates with regards to those who own, control, and manage the means of production, and then those who serve, or in a position of serving those who own, control, and manage the means of production. I mean, a socialist society would be actually being a more democratic society with respect to individuals having more voice in terms of decisions being made that will affect and determine their lives, even decisions about wages, for example, right? The worker in a capitalist society is not in a position to determine the wages that he or she will receive or the benefits that he or she will receive. And one of the ways that capitalism works is it has to maintain what Marx called the reserve army of laborers, right? That capitalism itself demands a certain level of unemployment, right? It demands a certain level of unemployment because if you're working for a particular company and you're upset because you're not making the wages you think you deserve, and the working conditions are poor and you're receiving no benefits, when you complain, there's already a line of people waiting for that job, right? So you're less likely to complain. And this literally happened at the University of Kentucky a few years ago when we had a large number of budget cuts and a lot of positions were closed. And I would overhear people like secretaries who work in the offices, they'll be out for lunch, and you can imagine an office where you've got 8 people working and 3 of them are fired or laid off, right? And there are no new hires. So now the 5 who are left have to do the work of all the 8 people who were there before, right? And they can't complain. And they can't ask for higher wages because they'll be next out. There's already somebody in line waiting for that particular kind of job. So this is what Marx means when we talk about the thingification of the worker. The worker becomes just a thing or an object to be used, and this is a part of the alienation too, right? Because the worker often produces, the worker often produces products that he or she can't afford to buy, right? And they produce these products for the wealth of someone else, right? So this is how capitalism works, and what we're seeing is that gap between the rich and poor continuing to grow, and that's by design, right? It's not by accident, right? It's not by accident also that a lot of our jobs are going to animation, which increases the unemployment rate. And socialism is an attempt to at least construct a society where that kind of thing isn't happening. I could say a lot more, but I'll stop there.
Just to add one thing to that, when I called Marx and Engels philosophers of a second enlightenment, that there was a need to have a new enlightenment beyond that of the American founding fathers and Kant and Rousseau and Diderot, etc. The reason for that is the twin problem, which are deeply related, which is in a sense the theme of my talk, unemployment and the renewed power of the state. Thomas Jefferson or Adam Smith or Immanuel Kant, any of those people who were thinking about bringing modern society into being as a free society had no concept of unemployment, none. It had never existed, right? And that's how early capitalism or bourgeois society is a type of civilization in your terms. and capitalism is not. Capitalism has a problem that no society in the history of the world has had, which is a problem ultimately that breeds visions of genocide, because it creates the notion of superfluous people.
Yeah, I just have four very quick points in response to your question. One is that, I mean, what's addressed in the book that Dr. Spencer just was pointing at, which is the literal manifestation of the Second War Enlightenment, which is the dialectic of enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno. And in the book, what they are arguing is that with the spread of the capitalist production and industrialization, the struggle for survival that determined most people's conditions for existence throughout history, which is a dramatic new level. So essentially, the individual struggle for survival that characterized how people made choices up until the beginning of what we call capitalism or bourgeois society goes into a different register once we economize on the basis of the capitalist mode of production and industrialization. If we adhere, which so far we have, and there's an entire vast incentive structure in place to make sure that we hold on to the individualist perspective on struggle for survival and self-preservation. If we continue to do so, this system will blow itself to bits. It's impossible for us to economize on the basis of the capitalist mode of production via industrialization on the basis of this individualist perspective on self-preservation, struggle for survival. The other thing is, and these are just pointers, essentially you can't construct, and this is the other question you asked, you can't construct a socialist society on the basis of alienated beings. At the very least, what you would have to have are alienated beings who are aware of the fact that they're alienated, what that means, and who can accept it. No one wants to think of him or herself as an alienated being. So the necessary precondition for moving in the direction of constructing something that deservedly could be called socialist society doesn't exist along those lines. This is a theoretical argument, of course. The third point is that we basically would have to, this is very much along the lines of what Professor Farr said, we really have to reconsider the language that we've been using. We have to create a new language. So, for example, when we think about democracy, we think about actually existing democracy, the way democratic institutions and processes have been established and reproduced. And so we need to tweak this in some form, and then we'll basically can parallel approach various problems. Solving problems is not really part of the agenda. And so, for example, the fixation on the presidency as the greatest achievement anyone can aspire to is totally regenerates this entire mindset that goes hand in hand with this. And the fact that, I mean, this, if you look at Plato, for example, the fact that we choose presidents by waiting for people to self-identify and then self-aggrandize, I am the greatest person to solve the problems of not just American society, but the world. Choose me. That's all wrong. That's in a functioning, non-violent socialist society, that never would happen. It would have to come to the people. The people would engage in discussions. Who is the kind of person who we trust will actually be able to approach these problems and coordinate us in a manner that leads to the achievement of certain goals. That doesn't work if basically megalomaniac individuals basically throw themselves up to having the ability to do all of that. And I'm not just talking about the current one. This is the system that's in place. And then the last point, this is a very minor point with regard to the capital, the logic of capital being a non-human force, non-human logic. I didn't mean it literally in terms of non-human. What I meant is that the kinds of humans that are necessary in order to ensure the promulgation of the logic of capital have to be very much reduced humans. We cannot experience nature, for example. We cannot enjoy nature. We cannot relate to others as measures of all things, so to speak. Man has the measure, or human beings has the measure of all things. We constantly have to put everything in place in terms of how it serves our purpose of survival and attaining goals that we have set ourselves, i.e. success. So in that sense, there's a very different, basically the argument that you made then is totally jives with what I was getting at. Being a human meant something totally different, not radically 100% different, but being a human being meant something different before 1800 than it has meant since then, and the difference between pre-modernity and modernity is becoming more extreme with every generation. So we don't really know what we are not. We are what we are as a consequence of the circumstances that we are born into, and as I like to put it, humans are adaptation machines. We internalize the conditions and we code them as natural, and then we go with that, etc. It's a problem. It's another reason why we need this, basically this transposition of psychoanalysis to a social level.
All right, so I think we have maybe a time for one more short question, then closing remark. Does anyone have? Okay, good.
So
Why don't we take all the questions that are here?
Actually, yeah, that's
If
a good
anybody
point.
has questions,
Yeah,
look.
Nikhil, do you also have a question too?
Yeah, please.
Just you two? Does anyone else have a question? Okay, so we'll take state your question, then we'll go to Nikhil. Thank you.
so I'd like to formulate this as
Yeah,
two
we'll
points
begin.
and then the question. So the first point is that modern technology is fast, global, and immediate. And so we get things like Facebook selling consumers as consumables in order to market in a hyper-dichotomous, individualistic way. AI is so fast that it's replacing what we consider to be very human jobs for a very long time. So considering that, and then looking at the fact that when we see Marxism manifesting, especially in the 20th century, it tends to aggregate ideas, and so you have Stalin following Lenin, and then Mao following Stalin, and Albania following Stalin, and then North Korea following Mao. And so how do you suggest that we separate this middle ground and get back to the source of Marxism when the source of Marxism in no way could have predicted the technological processes that we have now?
And Nikhil, you want to give your question too?
Yeah, I actually want to ask a question in relation to the possibility that possibility of socialism that exists in American society, at least in its current form. So what I understood from one of the panelists that actually that reminded me of what Arnold said was negative dialectics that what has not been observed theoretically will often yield its fruit for contagion. So my question would be like, it seems that Bernie Sanders, suppose, who is now leading a subtle revolution in American democracy, and almost all leftists, liberals are rallying behind him. So I have a deep suspicion of any liberal leftist, not because that actually I don't like left to be leading the society, but because those liberal leftists, to a great extent, actually, in my understanding, they linger. They destroy the possibility, real possibility that exists in a society for socialism. So what do you think actually in relation to this? Am I clear in my question? Like, so again, to me actually liberals are more inimical to the possibility of socialism, because there, what all of you actually said, they inculcate anti-democratic elements inside individual minds under the guise of democracy, which is more dangerous than what conservatives are doing. So like, I'm trying to let's see actually what do you think about about how leftist liberals in America are rallying behind Bernie Sanders, who is again leading a so-called revolution in the United States. Is it damaging for real possibility of socialism, or is it helpful?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of time for both of those questions. Just have you very, very brief responses.
I'll real quick try to tie parts of two of them together, especially getting back to the source of Marxism, and then your question about the liberals. So one of the things that happens in the history of Marxism is highly problematic. Is by the time you get to Lenin, you got this notion of the vanguard, right? So the vanguard are going to bring about the revolution and educate the proletariat. So now you've got this, and there's a tension between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, who still believe that the revolution be led by the proletariat. But now you've got this sort of standing group, and in a way, we can maybe think in those terms, in terms of political leaders who are, even though they're advocating socialism, that what's happening is still not exactly coming from the people, right? Now we have to talk more, maybe in another context, about the liberals backing somebody like Bernie Sanders, that right? What liberals are we talking about exactly? Because among that population might be the people, but one of the, I think socialism was derailed in the past by, I guess, leaders stepping in place and the people not yet being prepared, right? And I think we might see something like that happening now. So the ultimate argument for me is that somehow the people have to be ready and participate or bring about the revolution. And I mean, Marcuse talks about sort of the conditions that must be met before the revolution can even take place, right? So it's not like human beings, let's say Americans as they are now, all of a sudden bringing about a revolution. But it kind of pre-revolution has to take place prior to the revolution. This reminds me of what Professor Dahms was talking about a few moments ago when he talked about we need to stand back from ourselves, right? And sort of rethink ourselves and rethink who we are. And there has to be a development of what Marcuse calls a new sensibility, right? That is a necessary condition for there to be any kind of revolution. Now, how do you make this happen among the people? That's the question, and I can say more about that, but I'm going to stop. That's where I would try to go with this.
Just to your question, Marx treats technology as embedded in social relations. And so that has the curious effect of Marx asking us to look at labor-saving devices, factories, which were eliminating massive amounts of previously traditional forms of labor already in the 19th century. Look at a factory as a labor-saving device and a means of putting people to work. In fact, the underlying imperative is that it put people to work. Marx has some crazy vocabulary for that you have to go through a long slog of reading him to get, in which he talks about how the factory is there to absorb living labor, and ultimately goes into a question of what he calls the dialectic of living and dead labor. So that modern technology, and this is what you see in politics all the time. Bring our jobs back. Put America back to work. Doesn't matter what it is, right? The point of Silicon Valley, the point of AI, the point of roboticized factories producing cars, the point of every form of production is to put people to work. And that imperative will get reconstituted again. And no AI is going to change it. Because this is the basis of this society. And it has to be dealt with in its own terms. It's not going to technologically go away. We are just in the latest industrial revolution. And don't listen to anyone telling you otherwise. It may have massive consequences for unemployment. It may not, but it's going to just be the basis on which capitalism is reproduced as a society. Just to the question of socialism. The issue of the Democratic Party is a capitalist party. It's the oldest capitalist party in the world. Marxists took the question of democracy and the party form very seriously. It's not just what you think. It's not just what ideas you have. It's the political form that you bring to bear. And that's why, respectfully, I completely disagree with intersectionality, because it's a politics based on the Democratic Party. That's what it's actually about. It's just about bringing different interest groups or constituencies to bear on capitalist politics. Socialism was never a politics of class. It was a politics of a workers' movement which pre-existed Marx. Marx took it as a symptom of his time, as a symptom that he lived in a new world, that all of a sudden people weren't willing to accept that, which is actually a relatively reasonable project, that my boss has my best interests at heart. The only reason why your boss does not have your best interests at heart is because of endemic unemployment. Otherwise, I'd be happy to let the president of the University of Tennessee speak for the interests of the professors. But that's not the situation. So the party form was mass politics was addressed in Marxism, and that's Marx and Engels were a part of that. But the Marxists, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, the ones that no one wants to talk about, because they actually tried to overthrow the state on a world scale. They were thinking about that question. How do you mediate politics with the socialist workers movement, with not only the needs of, with racial discontents, with the women's movement, but in fact with every democratic form of discontent? How do you lead the struggle for democracy? And it so happens that the only attempt that's ever been made to do that had an intrinsic relationship to unionization and to the workers' movement. But it was never about class against race, against gender. That's a complete misunderstanding of what historic socialism was about. That said, so in other words, Bernie Sanders is a misleader of the people, and we need a socialist party in the United States. Right.
Can we end it there?
Yes.
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 So that was good.
Yes, that's the end of that point.
Okay, so I apologize we couldn't get to any more questions, but if
Harry hasn't had a chance to respond to this question.
well, do you want to turn that into your closing remarks, or are you okay with that, or do you want?
Sure.
Okay. Basically, I would just but before we get to the closing remarks, I just want to throw out, just keeping in mind that all three of you were socialized and ultimately educated into being intellectuals, and so you don't, I'm just throwing this out there. You can choose to answer. You can choose to reflect this in your closing remarks or not, but just throwing it out there that, what is the relationship between Marxism, and intellectuals versus the workers, and is there any do you have any comments about your role as intellectuals versus the workers and so on? But obviously we do need to end this, so if we could please have strictly about 3 minutes for closing remarks for each. Would you like to start, Dr. Farr?
Sure. Well, obviously, I think being an intellectual does put you in a separate place from, I would say, average everyday workers. You're doing a different kind of work. It's a kind of work that may not be immediately comprehensible to the average everyday workers, but at the same time, I think the one, as an intellectual, especially one who calls himself a social theorist or a Marxist or intellectual who desires social change, one cannot separate oneself from the working class. And one thing I admire about Herbert Marcuse was he could do theory at the highest level, but was always politically engaged, and you find him modifying his theory over a period of time because he was actually engaged in what was happening on the ground, and was actually a student of his students, right? And so he teaches, but he's actually learning from his students at the same time. And so I think the term Cornel West uses when he talks about Antonio Gramsci and others is that the intellectual ought to be an organic intellectual, right? I often, when I'm at meetings at my university in various places, I know that sometimes I'm in the room because they want to appear diverse, and so they need that one person of color in the room. And I tell them that if I come into the room, I'm bringing my two grandmothers with me, right, who were sharecroppers. One got only a 7th grade education, one only an 8th grade education. So when I come in, I'm not just going to be Arnold, Farr, the PhD. I'm going to be Agnes and Carrie, right? I'm going to keep it real. And I think I'm also an activist. I'm involved in various activist movements. My most recent work is with the Poor People's Campaign. Look that up. Some of you may be familiar with the work of William Barber. But I'm on the state organizing committee for Kentucky. So there, I had to get in the streets of the people. I had to put myself in line to get arrested. I've been in position to get arrested several times now in the last year. I think it really takes it. I say to my colleagues all the time that we're getting to a point where the academic can no longer afford not to be an activist, right? Because we see what has happened to education, and we see that we're witnessing sort of the corporate takeover of colleges and universities, right? So we're not going to be free to sit in our ivory towers now and just do theory, but we're going to have to really get on the ground at some point. And so, yeah, I'll stop there.
Dr. Leonard?
Yeah. Socialism is the meeting of the discontents in the 19th century of the organized working class with intellectuals. Intellectuals who were the first ones to be in the coffee shop in Bohemian talking about the revolution, and workers who needed help in articulating their demands on society and on the political order. And I often comment to young people, and especially in Platypus, that you don't understand anything until you can teach it. What socialist intellectuals started to do was to teach on a total social basis. They were addressing a audience, so to speak, that was putting itself forward to learn, the working class, and they had to respond to the needs of that class. And in that's why socialist intellectualism produced the greatest intellectual of the modern age, because it was the profoundest attempt to communicate at the level of the needs of society as a whole to society. And so one of the funny things about Marx's writings is that it teaches you how to speak at so many different levels. A political program, a thumbnail sketch of the history of the world, a newspaper writing for the New York Tribune, Capital, addressed to intellectuals. He's operating on so many different levels, as did later Marxists. And that's why they are the towering figures that they remain. Because with the crisis of human freedom has come a crisis of intellectualism. Modern intellectualism itself is a product of capitalism. And the crisis of capitalism, i.e. the crisis of the attempt to overcome capitalism on a capitalist basis, has meant that intellectuals perhaps have no one to talk to, where we have this problem of who's the audience, right? The problem that the Frankfurt School first addressed when, by the way, there were mass communist parties and social democratic parties all over the world, and our problem where there's no such thing. There's just capitalist politics everywhere, and a hell of a lot of unmediated discontent.
Right, Dr. Dahms?
One of the questions has already disappeared, so yours to with regard to Bernie Sanders and liberals, etc., social liberals, which is what he is, and reconstructed 1970s European social liberal. And for the fact that I might have, basically, if I try to compute the different factors that we have access to, the different trends that are playing out, I think you're screwed. And the likelihood of this turning out well is quite small. Now there will be a fork in the road. I mean, we're already there. I mean, this fork in the road is still there. It's still here. It will be here for a while longer, where we can move in one direction, which basically leads to a resurgence of some form of totalitarianism. Because the problems that we'll confront over the course of the next 30 to 50 years are problems that will require draconian measures. So the question is whether this will have to be imposed on people or with people. If it's with people, then a constructive discussion of something along the lines of socialism will be necessary. Not a dogmatic one, definitely. It will have to be a very productive one in terms of what the ideas, very much along the lines of what both of my co-speakers were saying, had thought of. So basically what the ambitious, the utopian perspective, not in the sense of utopian socialism, but as a move beyond the status quo, beyond the established system of social structures and the social order would entail. There obviously is an interest in that. Whether that interest will be strong enough to counterbalance the trend that will move in the direction of certain things just having to get done in order to protect the existing social structure, that's a different question. And so, I mean, this brings into the picture the question of necessary preconditions, etc. So I'm not, I've said this in lots of different contexts, I'm not hopeful. I'm not particularly pessimistic either. I practice something that I refer to as radical realism, to basically just face the facts and extrapolate from there. Basically developing scenarios in different directions. I don't think basically we should have confidence that this somehow will work out. Something will have to be done. The incentive structure might change once we have to move people out of Florida, out of California, off the coasts, population density within the mainland will increase as a consequence of that, etc. That might produce a different environment for tossing around certain ideas, etc., etc. That's one thing. The other thing about intellectuals and activists, etc., definitely, and Dr. Leonard was looking at me when he was talking about intellectuals. I'm not claiming to be an intellectual, I'm aspiring to be an intellectual, but my job is here, so basically I'm an educator. That's my primary task. And so the challenge in that regard is to understand what the problems are, okay? To have a clear understanding of what we're up against and what likely is waiting for us, without trying to establish an alternative hegemonic system of manipulation. But the purpose of education cannot be to try to make people think certain things, etc., but for them to actually think. So for them to figure out what it actually feels like to think on one's own terms, to deal with the uncertainty that goes hand in hand with that, not to have clear-cut answers, etc., to experiment, to find new sources of information, to look for different ways of different literatures, etc., making connections that previously were completely unbeknownst to students, especially at the undergrad level, or the right impact seems to be very low at the graduate level. So I mean, that's basically, we basically need to create the fertile ground for us to think on our own terms in terms of the realities that we confront today, not the realities that we confronted 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, but the realities right now. And we need to basically draw on whatever resources we have to do so effectively. But it has to take on a social form. But if we do this as individuals, completely on our own terms, against everybody else, etc., it will just regenerate the whole system. So I mean, this is something my students are familiar with here. When I self-identify as a social theorist, I mean it in two senses. I'm a theorist of the social, a theorist of society, modern society, now in the 21st century. So it's an analytical, diagnostic, mechanical process, so to speak, of combining theories, etc., to achieve a better understanding. But I'm also a social theorist in the sense that social theorizing itself has to be a social activity. So that we have to do this together. We have to establish new forms of collaboration that enable us to achieve insights which each on our own would never be able to achieve. And so that's essentially, if you're asking for self-definition in relation to the topics we've discussed, that's how I would describe it.
All right. Well, that sounds like a really great note to end on. As you all leave, I would encourage you all to check out the Platypus review we have. Also, just a reminder of our the Platypus reading group every Wednesday down at HSS from 5:30 to 7:30, and also our coffee breaks on Sunday. And I'd also just to thank all of our panelists for graciously speaking with us today. I think they all deserve a round of applause, don't you? And with that, let's call tonight.
The organizers.
Right.
Oh, yeah.